It says consolidate and sustain. Naturally, the question arises, consolidate and sustain what? For whom, how, and for what end? This being a conference of think tanks, universities included, I have no doubt that this question will exercise in your minds over the next 2 days as you deliberate on the key issues that face not only the G20 countries, but the rest of the world. Certainly, as a welcome speaker, I feel less burdened to answer this question, at least for now, and that makes me like a lucky fish. As you convene today, the world that you inherited in the middle of the 20th century as innocent, hopeful, idealistic, youthful, has changed dramatically, and it is back to volatility and uncertainty. The nature of how we live, how we work, how we play has changed dramatically and will continue to change. We live in the dawn of the convergent technologies, what others refer to as the fourth industrial revolution, a world of so many convergences and divergences existing side by side. These changes have been inspired and fueled by groundbreaking research, innovation, development in areas such as natural sciences, medicine, technology, social sciences, humanities, and the indomitable human spirit. For the longest time, since 1945, both the victor and the conquered had believed in the ideal of a rules-based international order where peace and security for all nations would be guaranteed. And yet today, that world and that belief has been shattered by the powers and interests that have run down its foundations, namely the foundations of freedom, equality, sovereignty, independence, international rule of law, and the system of multilateralism. Due to greed, populism, and even barbarism, if I were to use that word, the entire international system has been destroyed, thereby risking the sustainability of the earth and humanity itself. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, powerful or powerless, believer or non-believer, the entire situation is untenable for us all. As we speak today, the Middle East has been turned into a launchpad for possible world war. And the road to silencing the guns in Africa remains a tedious and elusive. In a way, I'm trying to say that we live in a world of stark contrasts, of progress and regress, of convergence and divergence, of great starts and false starts, of poverty and wealth, of freedom and oppression, of war and peace, and so on. It is a world where human beings have produced the most remarkable human progress ever seen in history of human civilization, and yet, at the same time, it is the very human beings that daily threaten to undo the peaceful and harmonious coexistence of people, nature, the machines on earth, the very sustainable that your theme suggests we must consolidate. And what is to be done? The geopolitical shifts taking place in the world today, if engaged carefully, hold great promise for new rebalancing of the global power and fairer allocation of the resources. These shifts can serve as an opportunity and a platform to realize a truly transformed global governance system where peace and happiness thrive, far away from the threats of anarchy, war, and suffering. I am suggesting that most of the existential threats we face are human-made and that it can be overcome by humans too. However, it seems that whereas we have attempted to conquer our natural environment and mastered the machines, we seem to struggle or even to fail at conquering our subjective weaknesses, so much so that the quest for parochial interests and power, all at the expense of those in the margins of society, have come to undermine every great human achievement, I mean human civilization itself. I place the question of power and allocation of resources between and within nations at the center of the challenges we face. Democracy and freedom is a halo in the global north as it is in the global south. Citizens complain, rightly, that it lacks social content and consequently delegitimizes the state, as well as the whole idea of public value and public goods. The idea of people first has been replaced by the idea of profit first. As a result, the domestic and international politics have gone belly up. You do not have to look too far, just look at the rise of extremism and the right-wing populism in Europe, in North America, in Africa, and elsewhere in the world in the past 10 to 15 years. As an African university committed to shaping futures in the service of humanity, we believe that the conference such as this one can add value to finding the best possible solutions to our troubled world. We live in an unequal, unfree, and just world which faces the risk of major regressions. If spaces like the G20, T20, representing 67% of the world's population and 85% of the GDP and 75% of the global trade, are not utilized constructively to reset the world back into progressive developmental agenda that will see us expand human freedoms all over the world, we will be in trouble. This includes making sure that all former colonies, the African region, the global south, constitute a core part of the resolutions and the progressive agenda that must define the world we must leave behind for future generations. With the current crisis of migration, Afrophobia in Europe and elsewhere, it is becoming clear that the world cannot prosper while Africa and the rest of the former colonies remain behind. All regions of the world must develop on the basis of their natural resources, capabilities, knowledge systems, sovereignties, and through progressive internationalism, cooperation, and fair trade. Among the panels today is one on solidarity for human achievement of the SDGs, as was already stated by Dr. Pilani. I look forward to the discussion on economic, fiscal, and social policies required to promoting equality. I also note that several other panel discussion topics, such as reflections on global inequality, the role of the G20, trade and investment, global trade is currently in a state of flux. The reasons all of us are aware. We therefore look forward to this conversation. The panel on digital transformation is of particular interest to UNISA, this being a university whose very existence depends on continued innovation and equitable accessibility of digital technologies. We are aware that the digital economy presents the unprecedented opportunities and deepening inequalities across the globe. A sizable number of our students come from the type of socioeconomic backgrounds that make it harder for them to access our online platforms for learning and thereby negatively affecting their access to learning opportunities. And with this, colleagues, UNISA has a footprint in 130 countries, and therefore this is not just particularly the context of South Africa or the African continent. We therefore look forward to how the T20 provides thought leadership on how to redress the gap on the widening disparities due to digital technologies, especially becoming increasingly concentrated amongst a handful of powerful actors, thereby widening the socioeconomic disparities in our country, in the continent, in the global south, but also between the global south and the global north. Another panel will discuss financing for SDGs, as well as climatic changes and just energy transition is directly relevant to an institution such as ours because of energy as one of our catalytic niche areas, and as well the challenges we have just witnessed in Eastern Cape that demonstrate vividly the conditions and the challenges of our weather patterns, but also the rains. In conclusion, I'm hopeful that this conference will answer the call to consolidate and sustain, and that it will do so by answering the question and consolidating the sustainability. The question what, for whom, how, to what end, remain very important. I know that I've raised more questions than answers. I suspect that this is because of two reasons: that I've been given just a few minutes to talk, and that 60% of the world think tanks are represented in this event, whether physically or virtually. Therefore, we can rest assured that many answers will emerge from the engagements and deliberations. We are excited about the opportunity to engage with you and other distinguished participants in shaping collective policy insights that respond to the priorities of G20 heads of states summit itself. Your presence and contribution will be invaluable, and we look forward to a dynamic and impactful dialogue. In his poem, Return to My Native Land, the Martinican poet, author, and politician, the late Aimé Césaire, has this to say about the world in which he struggled and sought to change. Indeed, a world that is changing yet again and demanding a new struggle and a new set of ideas from all of us. And the voice declares that for centuries, Europe has stuffed us with lies and crammed us with plague, for it is not true that the work of men or women is finished. We have nothing to do in the world. We are the parasites of the world. Our job is to keep in step with the world. The work of men and women is only beginning. It remains for him or her to conquer at the four corners of his or her fever every rigid prohibition. No race holds a monopoly of beauty, intelligence, and strength. There's room for all at the meeting place of conquest. We know now that the sun revolves around our earth, illuminating the plot which we alone have selected. That very star falls at our command from the sky to the earth without the limit to seas. And therefore, it is important as we begin this conference that we do not lose sight for the fact that we are not the parasites of the world, that our job is to keep in step with the world, that every star falls at our command from the sky to the earth without limit or seas. And finally, I hope we can reclaim the progressive developmental agenda that must define the new emerging multipolar world order that lies ahead of us. And just maybe we may succeed to consolidate and sustain. Once more, welcome to UNISA, welcome to the University of the Land, the University of Leaders, and all of us from any continent and every continent of the world. Let us rally together and put our minds and heads together so that we can co-construct a future that we are proud of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, BC. I think you've inspired us now, but hopefully not for more recommendations. But thank you so much. I think you've really captured the essence of what a T20 is and the question of thought leadership. I'm not standing on the podium because then I'll tower. So I'm just got a very important point to make. And I think that the site of knowledge building, knowledge sharing, and knowledge production at universities, but also in think tanks, is really critical. And I think you've really captured that point for us in terms of how do we dare to invent the future, which is a Thomas Sankara quote that I really like. So thank you for that. Let me now call upon the Executive Mayor of Tshwane and to give us your impressions, but I think the role of cities is also very critical to the G20 and how we actually craft those engagements. Thank you.
This is the most kindest thing that people have done for me, this thing. I complain wherever I go that tall people are selfish, but I will not say that about UNISA and T20. Thank you so much for your kindness. I wanted to know how it feels to be tall. I can see all of you. Good afternoon, esteemed delegates, the distinguished scholars that are here, the members of the diplomatic corps, members of or representatives of civil society and government, members of the T20 community, friends and partners from across the globe. Good afternoon. It is my great honor to welcome you to the capital city of the Republic of South Africa, the city of Tshwane. We are also known as the Jacaranda city, and we are also known as Tshwane ya Mamelodi. That is our home. You know, I'm not gonna say Sundowns. I don't want to mention winners here. I don't want to mention winners here. We truly thank you for hosting this event in our city. I never take it for granted when there's a gathering of this nature that you have an option to go anywhere, but you chose to come to our city. And it's always a moment of pride for me to say, on behalf of the over 4 million residents of the city, welcome to our home. I hope we've been kind to you. To the organizers and the hosts, the South African Institute of International Affairs, the Institute for Global Dialogue, and the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, thank you so much for extending the invitation to the government of the city of Tshwane to be represented here today. If you only invited me for this speech, I'm not leaving until everyone goes home. I am a co-host for one of the tracks for G20, U20. Last week, we had our U20 Sherpa meeting. Alongside the U20 Sherpa meeting, we hosted the African Mayors Assembly. And because the U20 Sherpa meeting had all the representatives from across the globe, and I had to apologize in advance to say we're gonna talk about Africa, because we are told this is not coming back in this lifetime, at least while some of us are still alive. So we want to milk this opportunity for everything that we can get out of it. And my reason is that if this cycle of G20 can deliver results for Africa, I think half of the problems that we are dealing with would be resolved. So I'm not only selfish, but I see an opportunity here that while you are in Africa, for those who are coming outside our continent, we want you to know who we are. We want you to love us, but we must tell you who we are, so that the solutions that we are coming up with, you know who they're for and what will be the impact to the world if we get this right. And I want to thank you for the work that you are doing. I'm sure you don't get paid to serve in this track. There is no amount of money that can pay you for labor of love. The conversations that we are having through the G20, they are conversations that are supposed to respond to world problems. You never get paid to that extent. Now, what we then say is, while we're having these conversations, let's think about the humanity that Prof was talking about. Let's think about the human beings before we care about the systems. That if we know why we do what we do, the impact is gonna be guaranteed, because the impact is in the people. And so from my side and my experience as one of the co-chairs of the tracks, I'm really honored to be here with you today. One of the things that I think as the world we've struggled with is to come together and work together. I think it's because it's hard to work with other people. In Africa, there's a saying that if you want to go faster, go alone, but if you want to go far, bring others. I can tell you, as the executive mayor of a coalition with 9 parties, I would rather go fast than far. Because it is hard. So I'm talking about my experience. It is hard to bring everyone along. But this world has once been subjected to the most evil systems because selected people decided to make their decisions in dark corners. It's time now that we reverse that system, that this world that I see in front of me, this diversity, we must do it in the light, and we do it for the betterment of the future that we may not even benefit from. So what we did in our U20 Sherpa, when I got this invitation, Prof, I asked, what do you tell clever people? These people already know everything that I know. In fact, they know way more than. What is it that I can tell you or share with you this afternoon? And I know I don't have much time. The good thing is when you come after your principal, you don't have to speak for too long. And it happens to me all the time that my principal would always come before me, so the pressure is off. So what we did in the U20 track was so we are co-hosting with the city of Johannesburg, was to align ourselves to the G20 president, the call he made and said, don't make this a South African G20. Don't even make it a continental one or a global South. While we make sure that we take care of the different challenges that we face, but let's have an inclusive G20. When we had our U20, we then asked the African mayors that attended, what is it that you want the world to know about you? Now, one of the reasons why personally I had to make sure that the African mayors had a seat at the table is that when we were in Rio, we endorsed a communique that did not really speak to our realities in Africa. And other continents, other regions, they rejected the communique because they were confident. And I looked around at the African table, I was like, yo, we just endorsed something here. I don't think this speaks to the global South or Africa. And so I made a commitment, which the Mayor Morero agreed with, to say, our contribution should be to sharpen the voice of African cities. And I will tell you why it's important that we bring this element of cities to this conversation. And I said, there's no way that you can have leaders like us who don't have self-esteem in the global stage. What is it that we do not have that we need as an ingredient so that we can participate fully in this G20 cycle? The African mayor said, we don't want to be spoken about. We want to be the ones at the table. Professor Fikeni said to us that, in fact, he was representing the think tank. If you are not on the table, you are on the menu, something like that. He scared us. Yes, so we decided we don't want to be on the menu. But I think my reflections to the fellow mayors was to say we've been lazy as Africa. We have found every way to excuse the fact that we have not fought until the end. We would say we don't have resources. No, but the carbon emissions, they emanate from the global north. And I said, because we get our influence from the residents that have elected us to represent them, we have no choice but to be bold. And so this convening of the African mayors gave us an insight, and this is where I want to come in as to what is my appeal to you. I'm not representing all cities. I'm not elected to represent all cities, but I can give you insights in terms of what is happening or what the views are. We know that the African continent is still struggling with the legacies of the past that are systematic and they are structural. And we have not done much to reverse those. So whatever conversations that we are having, let's not ignore that, because we are not resolving the problem from the root cause. We are treating the symptom. Now, for me, if you treat a symptom, you are wasting time because you still have to come back and treat the root cause. And I'm saying through this G20, as Africa, this is our opportunity to say, what is the root cause? How do we respond to it? In Africa, levels of inequality are unprecedented. When you go to a typical African city, they know who the millionaires are, which they can count them, which families are millionaires. And 99% of the residents are at the bottom pit of the pyramid. So the inequalities have an effect because those who are at the bottom of the pyramid, they lack services. They lack access to quality education. They don't have access to proper infrastructure. They don't have access to economic infrastructure and economic opportunities. When we reflect on the effects of climate change, the people that are mostly affected by the effect of climate change are poor people, because we have not resolved the systematic and structural legacies in our cities, in our countries, in our continent. And when we were saying this, the colleagues from Latin America said, don't forget about us. So I think it's safer to say Global South. Now, this is where you come in. We've been talking about the challenges. They are well documented. We know them. One of the things that I think we, as the young generation in South Africa would say we are sleeping on, is the thought leadership. We want some of us to wake up and pretend we figured out life, and we then lead people from a point of ignorance. And when that point of ignorance is not producing results, we find excuses why I did not deliver. While the problem is that I've been leading people from a point of ignorance. And I always then asked in the city when I was very new mayor, and I asked, where are the elders of the city here, the thinkers of the city? Because it can't be that your work is only done with yourselves in the boardrooms while the society needs you out there. So the work that you are doing, the ideas that you have, how do we take them to the society? How do we build communities based on the ideas and the thoughts and the work, the knowledge that you have produced? Because what is missing for us is that even when we, as a city, we put out a bylaw, we never get to be challenged by the thought leaders to say, but you have not thought about this, we haven't thought about this. Now, we then get to lead you from a point of ignorance while you know better. And that's not only applicable to the city of Tshwane, that's in the world. That if you are looking at our responses to our challenges and the body of knowledge that is in society, it doesn't match. So I think for me, the first thing is to ask you, please do not hide in boardrooms with the knowledge that you have. Come to us as society, as communities. Let's partner. Let's make sure that the ideas are translated into action. Now, I'm going to be selfish and tell you about my city before I end. So the city of Tshwane is a city with over 4 million residents. The history of this city goes over 160 years. the history of this country can be traced in this city. And if you go to see this beautiful city, you will see the architecture of the city. But in this city that is so beautiful, almost 40% of our people are unemployed. Over 22% of our people go to bed without food. They live below poverty line. And the question is it because these people were born to struggle, or there's just poverty of ideas and poverty of action that has led them there? Now, we then have an opportunity to say, how do we then, because one of the things that we pride ourselves of as the city is that we are a city that has the second biggest diplomatic missions in the world. That's us, very proud. We are a city that is I think we're the third largest in terms of land mass in the world. So for those who grew up in rural areas like me, once you have land, you can't have poverty. But township, urban life is different from what I know from rural areas. But also we are a city that has a concentration of universities and research councils. And one of the things that I did when I became mayor was to meet the vice chancellors of universities. And I said, how do we work together? Because this leading from a point of ignorance is really, it does waste time. How do we make sure that the conversations that are being held by think tankers like yourselves, they get to be translated into what matters the most, the work of government? Because it's that work of government that enables us to draft policies and to lead people and to deliver services to the people. So my appeal for me is that in the city, obviously with the advantage of these research councils and university, there's a lot of work that we do for young people and with young people to make sure that there's innovation, that we encourage knowledge production, but it's always the gap between the knowledge produced and the knowledge used. That gap is too far. And one of the things that when we accepted this, I said, as a co-chair of this U20, I don't want to host a cliche of an event. I want to have your 2010 FIFA World Cup type of an event. That even today, when you mention that World Cup, everyone remembers it. It's in their hearts, it's in the infrastructure in communities, and there was legacy. And I'm asking this body or this track to say, whatever you do, we need legacy. Legacy can only be achieved if at the center of the conversations that we have, we put the people at the center. But government is not the only partner that you need. We have thriving industries in our cities. They are there. The question is, how do we then, the conversation you were talking about, the priorities, Doc, that we are focusing, in fact, it's very much aligned. We were discussing exactly the same thing at the U20 track. How do you then, this conversation not only be taken to government, but be taken to private sector, civil society organizations, and ultimately to the residents and the citizens of the various countries? Because what I'm not happy about is when we have an opportunity to produce and ideate and talk about these things, we become the beneficiaries. That's not how leadership works. When you lead, you can't benefit from your own actions. Most people miss it, but you know those people. And so for me, I want to leave you with this. I've said a lot of things, but I think I was having my own debriefing from the U20 Sherpa meeting. I think the first thing is that if we are to resolve the challenges that are faced by the world, we must acknowledge the role of cities as more than just territories. That if you can get, as I was saying to my colleagues, if we can get the 258 municipalities in South Africa doing the right thing, problems of South Africa would be resolved like this. And I'm saying the role of city, if they are saying that in the next, I think by 2050, 6 out of 10 residents of African cities will be staying, African countries will be staying in cities. Now, the question is, are we prepared for that growth? The urbanization, we are urbanizing, it's a good thing, but is our infrastructure prepared for that? Is our housing opportunities or housing architecture of our cities, are they prepared for that? But in the way that we do, are we doing it in a sustainable manner where we're going to end up with the resilient cities that can respond to the crisis of climate change that we just saw claiming over 90 lives in Mthatha? So that's the first thing. I'm asking that this T20 track, that you support urban innovation. And if you accept the role of cities in taking the world forward, that there must be a concerted effort to support the cities and the leadership of those cities to take it forward. One of the priorities that we focused on, and I think in these platforms, the more you say it, sometimes the more you make sense. We don't have money. We must find innovative ways to find money to fund the needs that we have for our people. And so this is a perfect platform to say, we hear green bonds, we hear blended finance. In the MFMA, those things are not there. So I'm continuing as if nothing has changed in the local government space while everything has changed. And it's going to take this track to say to us, this is how you now incorporate the new ideas about financing your infrastructure, but build your climate resilient cities. So the issue of funding, we want to leave with you to say, please help us. We need to have alternative ways of funding the needs of our people. Africa is a very youthful continent. It's a good thing. I see young people here, I'm very encouraged. I'm an old youth, so I don't count. We need to make sure that we invest in youth-led innovations and cross-border entrepreneurial networks. Prof, while we were we also had a priority or a task team that focused on investment. And we spoke about the Intercontinental African Trade Agreement. And none of the cities in Africa trade with each other. We trade at a national level. What a wasted opportunity. And we are saying, while the borders are there, borders cannot be a hindrance. It's then a T20, because I think you are the thought leaders, so I'm putting more pressure on you to say, how do we then even decentralize policies or agreements like the African Continental a trade agreement, so that we can then even trade with each other at that level, at a city level. But also, we also cannot ignore the fact that we need to expand access to digital infrastructure and open knowledge platforms. There's no way we're going to build this world if we do not have this. When we talk about infrastructure, we normally talk about the roads and rail and this and that. But we want digital infrastructure to be at the center of how we work, for obvious reasons. And so for me, and where I stand, I just want to offer my words of support from another co-chair of the tracks of the G20 to thank you so much for your labor of love, because what you are doing and the recommendations that you're going to be making, they are meant to build the world. And only a loving person can think beyond themselves. So thank you so much for that. And I want to wish you a very fruitful deliberations as you proceed. I'm very encouraged that we are not off track on the U20 side, that when the Sherpas meet, they will be talking about the same thing. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I think you've reminded us of a very few but very important things, that people matter, and that communities are made up of people and cities are communities. So thank you very much for that. And I think your experience in the U20 has really given us lots of synergies that we need to take forward. I'm trying to move the platform because I'm not sure if Ambassador needs it. Yeah. Thank you. I think the ambassador doesn't want to be too tall at the moment. But let me invite Ambassador Sue Sherpa for the G20. And thank you for being here. And the platform is yours. Thank you.
I guess, Madam Mayor, if I needed the help, I would look like a Nedbank champion. Program Director, the Honorable Councillor Nasiphi Moya, the Executive Mayor of Tshwane, Professor Puleng Legabula, the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, and the conveners of the T20, represented here by the leadership of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, the South African Institute of International Affairs, and the Institute of Global Dialogue. We are honored to be here today to speak to a meeting of the midterm conference of the T20. We hold the T20 in special regard as one of the key engagement groups of the G20, providing thought leadership, ideas, and providing solutions that governments have to consider. We are also pleased that there's a seamless overlap between the priorities of the various South African engagement groups. Yesterday, we spoke at the meeting of the Y20, the Youth 20, and it's interesting to see this overlap in priorities. So our engagement groups in South Africa under the South African presidency are in fact pulling in the same direction. And we're also pleased that these priorities that you are discussing are also overlapping with those of the government of the presidency of South Africa. And we will talk about those in a few minutes. So for that, we are really pleased that we are here today. So the South African presidency is historical because it is the first time that the G20 is hosted in the African continent. And it follows the presidencies of 3 other developing countries, Indonesia, India, and Brazil. So this is a historic opportunity for South Africa, but also for the Global South. During the past 3 presidencies, we've seen the development agenda being put on the center of the work of the G20. And the South African presidency, in designing its priorities, was also informed by this to ensure that we have a continuity from the work that was done by Indonesia, by India, and Brazil. But I must say that this has not been an easy period for the G20 these 4 years. Because during these 4 years, we also saw a phenomenon where the G20's work was affected by geopolitics. We know that during the Indian and the Indonesian presidency, the issue of the war between Russia and Ukraine loomed large over the work of the G20 and affected the nature of outcomes that could be achieved. The Indian presidency of the G20 was held in 2023. A few weeks after that, October 7 happened. So by the time Brazil held the presidency, they were dealing with both the Russian-Ukraine war, but also the aftermath of October 7. So now we come to our presidency, where again we see a very fast-moving geopolitical situations. The question is, what will this mean for the outcomes that we are likely to achieve in November 2025? So this is a challenge, not just for government, but it's a challenge also for the engagement groups, in particular an engagement group of think tanks, scholars, and other experts. We need your ideas to frame what could be the outcome of our presidency in November. And that is why we are looking forward to your presentation next week to the third meeting of the Shepherds that will be held in Sun City. We hope that you will present concrete proposals that can be considered by us and other G20 members as we craft the Leaders' Declaration that will be adopted in November. But these proposals from you should be practical and they should be feasible. We should not only focus on theoretical policy positions. So we are challenging you, therefore, to come to Sun City and to subsequent meetings leading up to November 2025 with concrete, actionable, and feasible proposals that we can take into account as we negotiate the Leaders' Declaration. We often hear a cry that, in fact, we heard this yesterday when we were at the Y20 meeting, that they had actually done an analysis of the Leaders' Declarations from the time that the Y20 was created in 2010. And they came to the conclusion that actually little was ever taken on board by the leaders in their Leaders' Declarations during this period of 15 years. And my understanding is that this applies to many of the engagement groups. So I think we can use, therefore, the South African presidency to change this situation. And sure, but it depends on you bringing to governments policy recommendations that are relevant, that are practical, and that are feasible, as I have said. So this is our challenge, therefore, that we are presenting to you. The G20 of South Africa, of course, also, besides the geopolitics, the world is also dealing with what others are calling a polycrisis of converging crisis, climate instability, mounting debt, persistent global inequality between and within countries, and generally a growing trust deficit and a fracturing multilateralism. So this is the context in which our presidency is being held. And again, we hope that you will help us navigate this polycrisis as governments. That is why, therefore, our presidency is held under the theme of sustainability, of solidarity, equality, and sustainability. Because these themes, in deciding on this theme, we looked at exactly and what was needed to deal with the polycrisis and the geopolitics that are facing the world today. And our sense is that this theme, and the reason why it is popular around the world, is because it does respond to these challenges that are facing the world. We need more solidarity, we need more equality, we need more sustainability to deal with the challenges. Therefore, the South African government therefore settled on 4 overarching thematic priorities when the president announced in Cape Town our presidency. The first is the issue of dealing with disaster resilience and response. And I think the events that happened in the Eastern Cape during the past week show the importance of us envisioning a new way of dealing with disasters. The second was the issue of debt sustainability for low-income countries. We know that during 2024 alone, African countries paid close to $80 billion just on servicing debt. This is not sustainable because now we have a number of countries that are actually paying more in debt servicing costs than they do on education and health. No society can survive without more investment in education and health. The third one is on the just energy transitions. We know that there's a big gap between the resources that are available and what is actually needed to implement the just energy transition. Hence, our presidency also seeks to harness financing for just energy transitions. The last one is the issue of championing critical minerals to ensure that they are used for sustainable development, especially in the African continent. We know that we can no longer do mining of critical minerals in the way that we did mining 200 years ago, where it was a question of moving minerals from the pit to the port. What we need now is value addition, local value addition, and moving the countries that are producing critical minerals up the value chain. So this is the thinking behind this priority, the priority number 4 of our presidency. In addition to this, we have also set up 3 task forces, and they also resonate with the work that we are doing as a T20. The first one speaks to inclusive economic growth, and I think everybody, all the engagement groups, do speak to inclusive economic growth. The second one is on food security. very central and very important for the African continent. And the third one is on artificial intelligence. So we are saying that the African continent cannot be left behind in the discussions on artificial intelligence. So these are the main priorities that we are pursuing, in addition to other issues that are always on the agenda of the G20, such as the reform of global governance and many others. So these are therefore our assessment at midterm, because we have now done over 60 of our 132 official meetings of the G20. And our assessment is that there is still overwhelming support for South Africa's priorities. This is what we get in the meetings that have been held so far of the working groups and in other international engagements that we are attending as the presidency. However, given the current geopolitical environment in the world, there are going to be challenges, obviously. And we know that some areas are going to be difficult than others. And we will again appeal to institutions such as the T20 to provide us with the necessary advice to deal with this. So, for example, subjects such as climate change, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender equality, international tax cooperation, we see that these are going to be difficult negotiations as we lead up to November. So we need to work together as the government and the engagement groups to try to find strategies of dealing with these issues. So in conclusion, I once again want to thank you for inviting us here, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I think you've really summed up the synergies between the engagement groups, the connectivity, as well as the fact that there's a space for us to all work together. So thank you very much, and a round of applause for all our three distinguished guests. Can I call Dr. Palani Mthembu to come up and present our guests with a token of our appreciation? And in addition, I would like to also call the other two members of the Secretariat, the T20, Ms. Elizabeth Siladopoulos, Professor Siphamandla Zondi, because we need to take a picture and keep this in the historical annals of our T20. Can we?
No, this one is definitely first. Oh, it's
Elizabeth. No, stay there. Thank you very much. Another round of applause. I'm mindful that we are running a little bit over time, so I want to hand over to the moderator of the next session, which is Ms. Siladopoulos. But while we...
That's it, Kisha. You're our brand ambassador.
So I'm going to call on Elizabeth Siladopoulos, who's going to moderate the next session, and she will then introduce her panel and, of course, set the tone for that. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Okay, the question is, do I need a podium? Do I need a stand? Do I? Oh, bugger. Okay. I was wearing my high heels.
Not high enough.
Not high enough.
There.
Ooh, okay. I've never been this high. I can relate. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Let me add my welcome to those of Sanusha and Palani to the T20 Midterm Conference. It's really wonderful to have you all here in the capital city of the Republic, even though I have a special soft spot for Joburg. Sorry, Mayor. Born and bred. But really lovely to see old friends and new friends, and obviously a good representation from the South African knowledge community here, which is, and the African knowledge community here, which is so important for these conversations, as I think both the Mayor and the Vice-Chancellor alluded to this afternoon. I'm not going to spend too much time now because I know we are running a little bit late. But the session this afternoon for an hour is really to bring to you some of the more granular elements and priorities of the South African G20 presidency this year. The ambassador, the Sue Sherpa, highlighted the big themes, the 4 key themes that are characterizing our presidency. What we've tried to do this afternoon is to bring some of the working group representatives to reflect a little bit more specifically on some of the priorities they have on the agenda, and hopefully what might the outcome be in those specific working groups. I'm going to call them up now, but I think, you know, the point that was made, I think was made by the Mayor about the importance of legacy. And legacy sometimes takes time to manifest itself. And so I know we go from year to year thinking, what is the concrete thing we're going to get out by the 30th of November? But sometimes what is equally important is the seeds that we sow that can be picked up in subsequent presidencies. And I think there are a number of areas in both the Sherpa and the finance track of the South African presidency that really focus, that are quite ambitious, and that perhaps we may not see something very, very concrete immediately by the 30th of November. But I don't think that is anything to be disheartened about. I think we have learned from looking back at previous G20 presidencies, and particularly the development ones, that the developing country presidencies, that one builds. So we have built on the Brazilian, on the Indian, on the Indonesian, and even on sort of some of them that were not even Global South presidencies, like the good work that was and good progress that was achieved under the Italian presidency, specifically around multilateral development bank reform. So that is my that's my positive message, and then I'd like to now call our panelists this afternoon to please come and join me on the podium, and just in the order in which they're in the program. Ms. Josephilde Nhlapo-Hlophe, who is responsible for the development working group, one that we've also been closely involved with and associated with. And it's also great to be able to welcome Ambassador Mlumbi Peter from the Trade and Investment working group, who I know some of the task force of the Trade and Investment task force have been engaging with. Ambassador Anesh Maestri, who is the person responsible for the Artificial Intelligence Task Force. As the ambassador noted earlier, South Africa has identified three task forces. One of them is on AI. The second is on food security, and there it's really also great to be able to welcome Ms. Shangia Butane. And then, of course, we've got the third one, which is on inclusive growth, employment, etc. But they're meeting right now, so they wouldn't be able to make it. One wouldn't be able to have such a discussion without including representatives from the African Union. I'd like to ask Ms. Pamela Gopal from the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, to join us. She is somewhere, or she was. Oh, she's behind me, right. And then last but not least, it's really great also to welcome Michael Sachs, Mr. Michael Sachs, who is from the Secretariat of the African Experts Panel, which many of you know was something that was put together, established under the finance track by our Minister of Finance, chaired by the former Finance Minister of South Africa, Trevor Manuel, which is intending to look at a number of issues that relate to financing for development, I suppose, and specifically how that impacts on Africa. So it's really great to have you with us, Michael, as well. Okay, so we've got 6 of you. We've got an hour. Let's make this happen. I suppose I'll have to stay here. There are mics. Okay, let me then start off. Let me ask you, Joseph Filder, to sort of kick us off. As I said, Joseph Filder heads up the development working group. Could you just give us some high-level thoughts on some of the key priorities, and also what you hope the outcomes will be over the course of the next couple of weeks? Because, of course, the development working group is going to have their ministerial at the end of July, and so a lot of the work that has been done that is going to be tabled there has already been completed.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, colleagues. Yeah, I am audible.
Stand here. Do you need this?
No. No, it's obvious that I'm standing. Good afternoon, colleagues. Just to say that because Elizabeth knows that I can speak for a long time, she literally phoned me this morning, reminding me that I only have 3 minutes to speak. But I'll really be quick. The development working group decided on 3 priorities, and we are truly hoping that by the end of July, because that is when we are having our ministerial meeting, the priorities will have been adopted. Why the 3 priorities? Maybe I should say the 2 priorities and a bit. I'm looking at. So the 2 main priorities for this development working group, it is reminding the world, but through the G20, that they did agree that they will adopt and implement social protection flows. Why did we think it is important now? We thought that if we are truly to live to this mantra of leaving no one behind, we have 5 years of ensuring that we have all implemented social protection flows and there is no individual that falls below a certain standard of living, which we have all adopted here. Now, in this particular theme, we are asking the G20 ministers to agree. For example, we have included things like ensuring there is social insurance, social security for people who are outside the normal workplaces. We've included unpaid work. We've said that they must remember that social protection and social security in particular is a human right, but over and above that, it assists, it's an investment. It's not just a consumption thrown there. So here it is fine. We have nice arguments about how far should we take it. Others want to include everything under the sun. We keep on saying, no, remember the ILO has already defined social protection under recommendation 202, but people want to include everything under social protection. So it's nice arguments like those that we are having, but everyone is very much for this particular a priority of accelerating a social protection, the implementation of social protection flows. Now, the second one, which is curbing domestic resource mobilization through curbing illicit financial flows, was informed by the fact that, one, we all know ODA is official development assistance is sort of disappearing now, as everyone is looking at financing their defense budgets. But over and above that, the truth of the matter is that there is a huge financing gap for the development, for the sustainable development goals. So, and yet there is a lot of money that is lost. The estimates are about 50 billion lost annually by Africa through illicit financial flows, and yet the financing gap for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals is about 2.5 to 4 trillion US dollars annually. That is for Africa alone. That can be extended for other continents and peoples of the South. So if we can mobilize our own resources domestically by just ensuring that what belongs to us stays with us, why should that be difficult? And this morning or yesterday, I can't remember anymore, but we woke up to good news. We also, the outcomes of Seville, the financing for development outcome. It's really favorable towards illicit financial flows, and therefore we are happy. We are thinking that the negotiations will be easy as we quarrel whether we are talking about a tax, how far we take the illicit, is tax avoidance included, tax evasion included within the illicit. But we are thinking that once we have those 10 principles, or not 10 principles, the number doesn't really matter. We had come up with 10 principles, and the colleagues said it could be more than 10, it could be less than 10. So let's just talk about the principles for curbing illicit financial flows. We will then, if the principles are adopted, we have then asked international organizations to take it forward in the sense of coming up with implementation packages for the 10 for the principles for curbing illicit financial flows. And that research will come back in 2027. It will take exactly a year to do. I will not explain why it will take a year, and not 6 months and not 18 months, but exactly a year to do, to be given to the next presidency after the USA. Then the last priority that we have is called a global public goods, the optimal provision of global public goods. It is not going to be a ministerial document. We've already agreed to that because for many reasons. One of the reasons is that we still do not have an official definition of what we mean by global public goods, even though the G20 in the Italian presidency declared immunizations and vaccines. It was during the COVID period as global public goods. But even before then, in 2016, when we were adopting the SDGs and SDGs implementation framework for the G20, we did talk about it, us as the G20 adopting it as the development working group, such that we implement SDGs and global public goods. But we are not quite agreeing around that. But also, colleagues are worried about a sovereignty, that maybe once we declared global public goods, we give people the license to come and do whatever they want to do because we have declared something a global public good. And we have put in a huge paragraph on sovereignty, that countries have sovereignty over their natural resources. So those are the two biggest challenges that we are facing in relation to a global public goods. All countries except two are really not for us even discussing this. And yet, colleagues, you were all there when we were, as the South, suffering from what our president termed a vaccine apartheid. But it's not the only a challenge that we face. The truth of the matter is that we need something, some framework, some discussion on how we optimize the provision of global public goods and how we finance the provision of global public goods. Thank you, colleagues. Is that coming?
Okay.
Thanks very much, Joseph Hilda. Over to you, Ambassador Mlumbi. Would you like also to stand at the podium?
No, you're okay. You're taller than me.
Yes.
Good afternoon. It's really good to be with all of you. We lead the Trade and Investment Working Group, and as you are aware, trade is going through significant shifts at the moment. We see a rise in unilateralism, protectionism, and of course, it's not only one member of the G20 that is implementing unilateral and protectionist measures. We see some implementing this in the context of reciprocity, some implementing it in the context of addressing what they call environmental concerns. But all of this has a significant impact on African countries and developing countries broadly. So as we're thinking about the priorities for our G20 agenda, in line with the priorities that have been outlined by Ambassador Mabongo, it was important to look at how do we build on the previous G20 presidencies, but also importantly, how do we come up with an agenda that will resonate with what Africa is trying to do in terms of its Agenda 2063? So we've effectively outlined 4 priorities, and I think as you look at the priorities, you will see the alignment with the other presidencies. The first one is trade and inclusive growth, and I think it goes without saying that even though we've seen benefits out of global trade, the benefits have not been shared equitably. Africa accounts for 17% of the world population, however, only 3% of global trade and less than 3% in terms of manufacturing capacity. But if you look at the continent, it has a number of reserves. Whether you're talking critical minerals that are required for the green transition or other resources, we have it all. However, when it comes to really being locked into global value chains at the high end of the value chain, we are not featuring prominently. So as part of this trade and inclusive agenda, we aim to develop principles that will inform how the G20 should promote trade and inclusive growth. But also importantly, an important outcome of this will be the Africa Cooperation Agenda. The Africa Cooperation Agenda will have 3 elements. One is voluntary support by the G20 to the implementation of the African Continental FTA and all its elements, but also importantly, voluntary contributions to the adjustment fund, which will assist to facilitate effective implementation of the AfCFTA. The second element is to mobilize investments for the productive sector of the continent, especially on those areas that we have vulnerabilities for. Joseph Hilda has spoken to the issues around the vaccine apartheid that we saw during COVID-19. Africa remains quite vulnerable. Therefore, the pharmaceutical sector is one of the priorities that we've outlined under this, including issues of food security. So agriculture and agro-processing are important, but also the need to transition to the green transition in terms of ensuring that African countries are integrated into the green value chains. The third element of the Africa Cooperation Agenda is to mobilize investment for infrastructure development. We know that there's a huge infrastructure gap when it comes to the continent, but the focus for the TIWG is to look at trade corridors. Of course, we see a lot of interest currently around trade corridors. Lobito corridor is one such corridor. However, our view is that what we need to be careful and mindful about as the continent is the fact that some of these corridors are again driven by pit to port type of activities. So we now need to come up with our own value proposition, and we are working with a number of the African institutions, the ADB, outer NEPAD, to come up with a priority of trade corridors that really facilitate intra-Africa trade. The second element or second theme is a responsive agenda and investment agenda to address the challenges of global commons. And I think it goes without saying. But what we have prioritized under this agenda is not only to look at preparedness for future pandemics, but also issues of food security, digital trade, as well as to deal with the effects of climate change. And here we're looking at two effective deliverables, but under one outcome. So the trade agenda would look at principles that will inform how do we cooperate from a trade and investment perspective whenever there are challenges of global commons. The second element is to look at what are the reforms that are being undertaken in terms of the investment treaties to ensure alignment with issues of global commons. Third element is a G20 framework on green industrialization, heavily contested because some are saying they don't put color to industrialization. And of course, we see some of the pushbacks now against the issues of climate change and greening the economy. So we are having lots of discussions. But effectively, what South Africa is looking for under this theme is what we term the grand bargain on green industrialization, where we would balance the need to preserve supply chains, but also at the same time ensure that we underpin this along the principle of beneficiation of critical minerals at source. So it will be about coming up with this grand bargain that ensures that there's shared prosperity from issues around critical minerals and green transition. Last but not least is WTO reform, and it will include the development dimension of the WTO. When it comes to WTO reform, I think if you look at the current developments with regards to global trade, it's clear that the reforms that developing countries have been calling for since the Uruguay round have not been delivered because, of course, there was a delay, especially by countries of the North, to really engage with WTO reform. However, now what we see in terms of industrialization, the rise in industrial policy, the use of specific policy instruments, including local content requirements, means that there's a need to recalibrate WTO rules to provide policy space for industrialization. We've been calling for this as South Africa, and we are saying now that everybody appreciates the point, it's important to come up with an agenda that will talk to this. Lastly, as I conclude, South Africa's presidency is taking place just before a critical ministerial of the WTO, which is the 14th ministerial conference, which is to be held in Cameroon, second one on the African soil in March 2026. So South Africa's G20 presidency is a nice conduit to Cameroon, and therefore it's important to ensure that what we seek, of course, is a statement on WTO reform and this development dimension, so that the ministers can send a strong message to the Geneva ambassadors in terms of what would be credible and development-oriented outcomes for the 14th Ministerial Conference. So there's a lot of discussion around this issue, and also what we've done during our presidency in the first in-person meeting that we held in in Somerset West was to convene what we called a brainstorming session on what should be the forward-looking agenda when it comes to global trade, given that all of us from different perspectives are raising concerns with regards to the multilateral trading rules and the need to reform the system. And we've been very clear, we are not targeting measures of any specific country. However, we want to have this forward-looking agenda where also we did invite inputs from the T20, from the B20, and from the L20, so that we can look at an agenda that does not only resonate with governments, but also with the people that we're trying to serve when we set trade rules. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ambassador. I think two very good presentations, also giving us a sense of where the constraints may arise. Just to say, and picking up also on what Ambassador Mabongo said, the brief today to all the task forces this morning was they've got to be feasible. The recommendations have to be feasible. They have to be actionable. They have to be relevant. And some of them may be, low-hanging fruit. Some of them may be longer term, but they have to really be helpful to policymakers. And also, and that was the session we had just before lunch, what might be the constraints to driving some of these recommendations forward? And I think that has also sort of caused, that process has caused some of the task forces to also just go back and tweak a little bit and rethink some of the ways they're putting forward the recommendations. So hopefully it will be helpful to all the working groups. I think, Anish, you're up next. Eh? Ambassador Anish Maestri, as I said, Artificial Intelligence Task Force.
Your Worship, the Mayor, Vice Chancellor of UNISA, colleagues, good afternoon. The Task Force on AI, Data Governance and Innovation for Sustainable Development is chaired by the DG of Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, DG Jordan Diani, and she's been leading us to an outcome that we feel would be a legacy project for South Africa, given that this is one of the high-level deliverables that we have for the G20 presidency in being the third task force. From the outset, I must say that the guiding principles that the task force has located in its work, and which I must also have a caveat to say that is generally accepted, is the issue of responsible and ethical AI. In any conversation that we're having on the issue. AI for all. AI is a borderless technology, but there needs to be some regulatory framework that's in place. And with that said, it was stated that the G20 can set an example, because AI is a moving target, and it's very hard to keep abreast with what's happening in its developments as a general purpose technology. But it's something that is going to really impact a lot of the work of the other working groups moving forward, especially for the G20 and just with multilateralism and bilateral relations alike. Another topic that has been raised as a guiding principle is data sovereignty. And a lot of countries have really reaffirmed the issue of data sovereignty. And also that AI and its innovations is very incumbent on private-public partnerships. You need the private sector to be part and parcel of it, because they have such control and ownership over data sets and the infrastructure that they've become important actors in the entire ecosystem. And then for us as South Africa, this is a G20 African presidency that we have front-loaded from the start. And for us, having a conversation about AI, it's clear that Africa cannot be left behind in a potentially increasing global digital divide. The two particular frameworks that are guiding principles also for the task force is the UN Global Digital Compact, even though I must say that there are a few states, one state in the G20 that has not signed up to it. And the other one is, for us, important, the AU Continental AI Strategy for Inclusive, Sustainable, and Resilient AI Ecosystems. So that said, for us, a successful presidency with this task force, what would that encompass? And that would be an inclusive AI adoption and governance. We see that as a baseline. For us, our legacy project out of this, which we have been working particularly hard at, is the AI for Africa initiative. And that will culminate in an AI for Africa conference, a high-level conference that we're hoping that would be opened on the highest levels within government, and with the attendance of ministers from the G20 countries and invited countries. Then we'd also, and we've done a lot of work around this, looking at launching a G20 Technology Policy Assistance Facility. We have already done a feasibility study and a report on that, and we are working through that. We just have to look at the modalities of where it would be located. Ideally, we're looking at an African country for that technology policy assistance facility. But that said, it's an online tool to really support technology policy development in the Global South. And then we're looking at the issue of a statement around connectivity and inclusive digital development. It needs to have the words equitable, inclusive, and just AI. We've looked very deeply at the issue of AI and inequality and access to data and digital public infrastructure, and those conversations are ongoing. And lastly, the issue of information integrity. So in conclusion, for us, a reaffirmation of our AI commitments from the member states, especially for a commitment to the development of technology and its innovation in Africa. Look at bridging the scientific divide through other cross-cutting working groups on for Africa and the rest of the world, and looking at innovation ecosystems, and the need for investment in AI capabilities within the AU framework, and of course a focus on ethics, integrity, and responsible AI systems as we transform scientific enterprise and society. That said, from the 22nd to the 26th of September, we will host the 4th Digital Economy Working Group and the 4th AI Task Force. This will move straight into, on the 29th, the Digital Economy Working Group Ministerial. And then on the 30th, we will have a morning session where we will launch the AI Task Force Ministerial. And in the afternoon of the 30th, we will do a high-level launch for AI for Africa, which will move into the 1st of October. And hopefully we would be able to, at the ministerial, have a high-level statement that is accepted by all members of the G20 and invited countries. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anish. I am going to ask Mpilo to come up before Pamela, simply because I think we then just take the two task forces that are present. So it's good to have the person at DIRCO responsible for the Food Security Task Force, Ms. Shange Butane. Mpilo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, colleagues and everyone. I would like to stand on the already existing protocol, especially since my Sue Shepherd already spoke. Mpilo, as Elizabeth has said, I am the coordinator of Task Force 2, which focuses on food security. I came in here, I think many of you had just enjoyed the right to food. I think we had just returned from lunch, but unfortunately it's not the case for everyone. As it has already been said, while South Africa holds this G20 presidency, we are also taking the African continent along, but also the Global South. As many of you would know, our foreign policy really prioritizes ensuring that the voiceless are heard. So food security would assume that everybody is food secure. But as I think I'm happy that I'm here, I'm speaking to people who are used to reading, researchers,
That's even here in South Africa, we know that as much as we have sufficient food at a national level, but at a household level, we have rising food insecurity. So in terms of the priorities for the task force, which was part of why the presidency decided to have this task force, is just to try and really address the day-to-day needs of many of the populations in the countries of the Global South, some of whom we are members within the G20, some of whom are not within the G20. But because the G20 has influence, it was decided that it's very strategic for South Africa to establish this task force. So in terms of the priorities, the thrust of the priority on food security is really to ensure accessibility and affordability. And how we are doing this as South Africa is we have commissioned studies that tackle macroeconomic issues, but also others that look at some of the micro issues. And the work that we're doing is actually building from previous work that's been done within the G20 addressing food security. I think the most recent initiative is the one that was done by Brazil, where they established the Global Alliance Against Hunger, which specifically looked at the national level. So the work of the task force that we are doing is focusing at a regional and global levels. So just to be specific, my colleagues actually said, because almost like Mama J there, I don't finish talking. I keep referring to my notes. So the first pillar of the focus areas is to focus, as I said, at a regional and global level, particularly looking at the strategies and regional approaches that are climate resistant and sustainable, including looking at some of the regional initiatives that will help us towards ensuring food security. And then the second set of the regional studies is looking at the feasibility of various commodity price stabilization techniques, again at regional and global levels. And the aim here is really to mitigate food price shocks and thus prevent the increase in hunger and poverty. So the studies, initially we had envisaged as a presidency that we will conduct 4 studies that will lead us to our outcomes. But of course, because we are part of a group, in terms of the engagements in the meetings that we have already held of the task force, members also gave their input and their advice. So we've consolidated the studies. Now we are undertaking 3 studies, but still the main outcomes that we're looking for have not changed. So study number 1, we're focusing on analyzing the global macroeconomic factors and key drivers impacting global commodity price volatility, domestic food prices, affordability, and accessibility of food. And we have here our lead institution is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO. And then the second study is exploring the feasibility of various commodity price stabilization techniques at regional and global levels. And our lead partner here is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, supported by the University of Massachusetts. And then the third study is exploring the food security policy instruments and food systems approaches that are most effective, sustainable, and climate resilient at national, regional, and global levels. Again, here, some of our partners include FAO, IPATC, and the Committee on World Food Security, which South Africa is a member of. So in terms of the approach that we are using, whilst we have these global partners leading some of the work, what we are doing also is almost like a twinning exercise where for each of the studies, we also have key national institutions that are working with these partners so that they bring that voice, firstly from South Africa, but also from the global South. So those include SAIIA, for instance, and then Institute for Economic Justice, the Agriculture Research Council, and others that are working on food security within the country. In terms of indicators for success, Of course, one of the main things that we want to be able to achieve is a negotiated and agreed to ministerial communique, where the ministers of the G20 are committing to ensuring food security, and also having agreed to adopt one of the key outcomes that we want to have is to have a G20 high-level principles on food commodity stabilization techniques, looking at both global and regional levels, again, to achieve food accessibility and affordability. We're also looking at proposing regulatory frameworks and standards on international commodity markets and corporations in the food sector. There has, of course, been contestations and contentious issues as we engage with other G20 members, where, for instance, one of the issues they've raised is that South Africa's ambition is too big. Like, we dream too high. And we tell them that we would not, of course, be South Africa if we didn't do that. But we are willing, of course, to concede where it is possible, but we are not willing to lose the vision that we have in terms of ensuring food security. The other thing that we are proposing, the other outcome that we'd like to have is a monitoring, evaluation and learning framework. So when we come up with these high-level principles and policies and regulatory frameworks, we want to be able to do monitoring in terms of tracking for each of the G20 presidencies where we are in terms of progress being made on the commitments that were made during South Africa's presidency. We have one area where, for instance, members have suggested that because it's a very broad area, we should be able perhaps to begin the work within the South African presidency, but then hand over to some of the already existing institutions like the Committee on World Food Security, which is responsible for developing global policies around ensuring food security. I will pause here, colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mpilo. There is absolutely nothing wrong, and I say that as a think tanker, about thinking big and having ambition. Because I think the one thing that the G20 is also about, because it's not a formal institution, is how you build consensus around some of the big ideas. And as I said earlier, some of the big ideas may not, their time may not have come yet, but if you don't put them on the table, their time will never come. So thanks very much. Let me call on Pamela Gopal from the African Union Development Agency, also known as AUDA NEPAD. Many of you will remember it as NEPAD. And then we'll round up with the money man, the Africa expert panel.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much, everyone. And in the diplomatic space that I work in, we say all protocols observed. So good afternoon again. I just want to also start by echoing the African Union, embraces this, the recognition of it being in this dialogue discussion and in this platform, so that we can actually amplify, the African perspectives and priorities in the space and contribute to these international policies that we have been shaping. I'm also a member of the Task Force 4 group, so we've been working tirelessly since this morning, Joseph Oda, and we did include all the DWG priorities of the social protection flows, the global public goods, and the international financial architecture. So no deletes and no bracketing, everything should be there. Just to touch on the African Union, we have distinct priorities in terms of how we want to guide our own efforts by promoting economic development in the continent, and as well as through the international collaboration that we find ourselves. And some of the preliminary priorities, and I say preliminary because it's shaping, and we're a new member. Thank you. We're a new member, and I think, as I said in the beginning, we embraced it. And some of the priorities that we have zoned in on is certainly the social inclusion and the fight against hunger and poverty. And this is directly in line with the Global Alliance for Hunger and Poverty, as launched last year with Brazil, as well as through the energy transition and promoting the sustainable development in terms of economic agendas, social as well as the environmental dimensions. The other priority, also aligning to the G20 at the African Union level, is the reform of global governance institutions by prioritizing economic integration and development, and to address the inequalities and job creation. This is done mainly through the initiative of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, simply to enhance the trade and investment in the continent. And as also amplified by Ambassador Zolele, who works with the African Union in terms of the trade aspect. Regarding the African Union Development Agency, in specific through the program that I represent, the African Policy Bridge Tank, we serve as a knowledge partner to the African Union and to facilitate this exchange and collaboration on key development priorities and the issues impacting the continent. And we can do this and find ourselves in a position to be able to equip the African Union with this knowledge, given that we have a footprint in 55 African countries programmatic-wise. In specific, the African Union Development Agency supports critical infrastructure development in terms of energy, transport, technology, to facilitate this economic growth and, more importantly, the integration. We also assist our member states in achieving the Agenda 2063 goals and the Agenda 2030 through the alignment of our national development plans. And the agency specifically does this through strategic plans, mobilizing of resources, as well as capacity building. Most importantly, for the G20 and the T20, we're working with the member states to promote these policies that enhance regional economic integration and to boost trade and investment among African countries to achieve economic resilience. With that, I hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Michael, and of course, Michael used to head up the budget office as well, so definitely the money man.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm a member of the Secretariat to the Africa Expert Panel. The Africa Expert Panel to the G20 Finance Track, which was appointed by the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, and is chaired by Trevor Manuel, and includes about 23 African and global experts on issues, I suppose, related to financing for development. It's going to produce a standalone report for the heads of state. So its work doesn't necessarily feed into the formal negotiation process. But, I should say that it's been convened at a late stage in the process. So we're busy going through the discussions and trying to generate some ideas. And it may be that for this G20, we do try to think bigger and lay seeds for future growth, hopefully. So most of the discussion in the panel has been around the financial aspects, global financial aspects of the issues under discussion. And I suppose the framing concept is the cost of capital. What is the cost of capital? You could think of it as the interest rate that the bank charges you, or that somebody charges you to borrow to make an investment. And we know, as Joseph Filder said, that we've got this huge financing gap for achieving sustainable development goals and climate goals. But it's not just a gap in terms of the volume of the financing, the amount of capital that needs to be raised. There's also an important question about the cost of capital, because developing countries systematically have a higher cost of capital. African countries systematically face a higher interest rate in global markets than other countries. Of course, for many countries, the largest element of the cost of capital is related to what I would call the sovereign risk rating. So for instance, in South Africa, we would think about most of the spread, the interest rate that we borrow as a sovereign in South Africa above, say, the US Treasury, is explained by this sovereign risk premium, which you could call a political risk premium in a sense. And this relates to sovereign debt. And of course, then we can't have a discussion about sovereign debt without noting that many African countries are in debt distress. This is not the first time. This appears to be a recurring cycle of debt distress. And, it occurs for reasons beyond the control of African governments themselves, because a lot of the debt that has caused the distress was contracted about 10 years ago in the wake of the global financial crisis, where interest rates were very low and global growth was very high. And now, the crisis we're facing today involves, part of it is a sharp increase in interest rates globally for the whole world, and a slowdown in the rate of growth for the whole world, a lowering of falling of commodity prices, and then you add on to that a trade shock. And even I've heard that the US administration is planning to impose a tax on remittances. In other words, if Africans live in America and they want to send home money to the Trump wants to tax that, which is something that Mexico is making a lot of noise about. And something that I think, I'm just flying kites here, I think Africa needs to also get in on that discussion. So, but what is debt distress? And there are different kinds of debt distress. Zambia, or let me say this, Zambia faced a debt distress, and in the sense that it could not pay its debt back. And when a country declares that it's no longer willing to pay back its debts, this becomes a problem for creditors, for the people who have lent the money, because they want their money back. But for many other, and this tends to lead to action and tends to lead to creditors coming together in the Paris Club or in the G20, what we call the common framework, to try and negotiate with Zambia as a collective of creditors, that debt resolution. But for many African countries and for most developing countries in the world, they don't find themselves in a position of debt distress in that sense. But what we say is what Ambassador said earlier, that we find ourselves in a position where we're spending more on servicing debt than on healthcare or education. And let's say this is not an uncommon problem. In fact, South Africa itself is one of those countries who finds itself in that position. It is not in debt distress. It is not saying we are not going to pay back our creditors. It is not creating a crisis for creditors. But as a debtor, South Africa is forced into a position of austerity, essentially, permanently because of this debt. So some of the reasons, as I've alluded to, of course, when we look at issues like the cost of capital and debt, a big question is this about global systemic features, or is this about domestic policy problems? And that will obviously be a debate at the G20 and is a debate. But we're trying to focus on the global systemic architecture and the features there that would contribute to these problems. And of course, global finance moves in waves. So you find, as I've just said, that at the moment when we're hit with all of these shocks that are outside of the control of African governments, that is the moment when the interest rate goes up. And it's more difficult to borrow, where that is the moment where you really need to borrow. And so there are economically necessary and technically feasible solutions or reforms that have been proposed. And in particular, I mean, in these areas where I'm talking, there are three important reports on the table, or about to be on the table. The first is the high-level expert panel chaired by Vera Songwe, which reported about a few months ago on healthy debt in a healthy planet. That's what it's called. And then there's the Jubilee report chaired by Joe Stiglitz, commissioned by the Pope, that I think is going to be tabled this week in Rome, and then, or was tabled. And then there's also the UN Secretary General has an expert panel on debt and development, which will shortly report. So, and between them, these reports do identify, as I said, economically necessary and technically feasible reforms The problem we have is the political feasibility of those reforms at this G20, given the context we face. So, for example, if you want to ensure that developing countries have more liquidity in times of crisis, like now, have more access to more capital, you can reform the IMF's SDR framework. Any reforms of that nature or any allocation of new SDRs can only be done up to a certain limit, because once you cross that limit, I think it's $650 billion, you need approval from the US Congress. And who knows what's going on there. So sorry to my American friends if they're here. So secondly, an approach of a kind of HIPC type initiative of wide-ranging debt forgiveness is placed on the agenda by many. But the proposal that seems to be likely to gain traction is more limited, and it involves this problem of paying more in debt service costs than you're paying for healthcare. Debt service costs are particularly elevated now, and according to the modeling, there's a bunching of debt service costs, particularly in low-income countries. So the idea is perhaps we could have a refinancing of debt service costs for the lowest income African countries. This wouldn't help countries like South Africa or Brazil or Egypt, but it could, and in a sense, there's a trade-off we have to make there, that the narrower the focus, the more easy it will be to agree. And so you want to have, a set of, because the point about the low-income countries is that in kind of dollar terms, their debt isn't actually that big. So if you could say we want to give this kind of debt relief to the lowest 10 countries, or income in Africa, it would probably be easier. But that would not solve the problem. You would ideally want it for everybody, but those are the kind of negotiations that I suppose is taking place. Another issue that is, as Elizabeth mentioned, the Italian G20 presidency initiated this process of reviewing the capital allocations to multilateral development banks. And there's been enormous amount of technical work done on that in the Indonesian and then the Indian presidency that was taken forward by Brazil into what we now call the roadmap for MDB reform. But again, this is judged by many to be not feasible politically, because it requires major shareholders in those multilateral development banks to stump up the money for the capital allocation, in a sense. So we're left with perhaps, in terms of concrete outcomes in the G20 finance track, maybe, a set of less ambitious but nevertheless important reforms that are being proposed. One is to analytical frameworks, debt sustainability analysis, economic modeling more generally, and I would include in there a dialogue with credit rating agencies that the G20 would convene between African countries and credit rating agencies. A second less or more politically feasible reform is maybe embedding contingent contracting for debt. What does that mean? It means when you sign the contract for the debt, it says, if there is a global pandemic declared by the WHO, this debt you will have a holiday from paying this debt. So you actually embed clauses like that in the contracting of debt, both through the multilaterals and in private bond markets. And lastly, I would say the last kind of reform to the global system we can make that is important is what people call a borrowers club. So we have a Paris club for lenders. We have clubs of rich nations, and there's no architecture that supports borrowers as a class of nations. And this is very difficult to do because it's complex. South Africa, for instance, does the opposite of what we're told in Hamlet, where we're told to be neither a borrower or a lender. South Africa is both a borrower and a lender, right? So this is complex, but I suppose it goes back to, and I mean, I wanted to finish off with this, because inspired by NEPAD, that the Borrowers Club points to solidarity amongst developing countries. That doesn't require anybody's permission in a sense. It just requires overcoming a kind of collective action problem. And defining and beginning to define another new partnership, I think, between Africa that really rests on this idea of solidarity. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Michael. I think really useful to get a sense of where the politics are. I think we've all got a sense about how difficult the finance task is, and of course what the Africa expert panel can put on the table in that regard. We are running. We've sort of taken about an hour, but should we take sort of 2 questions, literally 2 questions, short, concise, and directed to whoever you want to answer. So you have an opportunity to engage. I'm sure there are some questions, and then we will, literally, I'm going to take 2 questions. 1, okay, is there a woman who would like to ask a question? Okay, so 1, sorry, I'm going to be, I want some balance here. So maybe I'll take 3. 1, Celine, and I'll take 1 from there. There was a hand here? Who was the hand? Okay, we have 2 women. I'll buy you a drink afterwards. Okay, who was the first person? Yes. If you, there's a mic here, there's a mic. And please introduce yourself and the institution you're from, and then short and sharp. Just.
Hello, my name is Akram Zawi. I come from Morocco. I work for the Policy Center for the New South, which is a Morocco-based think tank. And our executive president is a member of the advisory council for this year's T20. Very happy to be here in South Africa first time. My question would be for the last presentation, and in particular on convening this dialogue between the G20, between Africa and CRAs via the G20. And you said it was politically feasible. I understand why, but generally speaking, my question would be about the importance of the G20 as G20, notably in view of the current US context. So could you envision doing things as the G19, or just using the convening power of South Africa to convene African nations and other global stakeholders?
Great.
That's my question.
Thanks. Second question was Celine.
Good afternoon, I'm Celine Kaufman. I'm the co-chair of the task force working on climate and energy transition in the T20, and I'm part of a think tank that is based in Paris working on sustainable development. Many thanks, because it was very rich and we learned a lot from your interventions. So I can't cover everything, but there is one topic, and I'm not going to go back to climate, but one topic that I understood was very much a priority for South Africa. You didn't mentioned here, and maybe it's related to the last intervention, was in relation to disaster risk reduction, and in particular to involving more the insurance industry and the insurance sector. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about what is planned and if it can be considered a source of finance for adaptation, for example, which would be a core interest for the Task Force 5.
Great, thank you.
Hi, yeah, I'm Miraisa Cole from Democracy Works Foundation and Foundations 20. My question is also for Michael, and it's also related to insurance and climate. But yeah, whether there were any considerations as using or identifying insurance as a safeguard for development gains, and therefore kind of funneling money away from debt and into development.
I think basically all of the questions were to you, and the others will take the Fifth Amendment.
Well, the one about the G19, I say it's above my pay grade. That one, you'll have to talk to presidents, I think, or at least foreign ministers about such things. But whatever the state of politics in the G20, it has a convening power. There are things, I mean, Joseph Filder mentioned the Financing for Development Conference, and I've seen things that EU is objecting to, and I'm wondering whether they're objecting because it says UN rather than G20. So there are gains that can be made at the G20 that can't be made in other contexts. I think even whatever the political context, and we've got to focus on that. In terms of the other questions, I also don't have good answers. There's a lot of discussion going on in the expert panel, and there's in these reports that I mentioned, there are many proposals, including about insurance, including about disasters and financing. But I just highlighted a few that I thought would be interesting. But all of this is certainly on the table now.
I think tomorrow we'll also have somebody from the climate, from DEFI, from the Department of Environmental Affairs, and I'm sure you'll be able to, I think you'll be on your panel. So you'll be able to ask the question on disaster risk. Okay, I'm going to bring it to an end because we're moving on to the next session, but I just want to say a really big thank you to everybody here for making the time and actually for giving us, as Celine said, a really very rich discussion and input. And I have gifts, which I suspect you don't have to declare. They have books, as one would give to a commentator. Okay. And I think we're going to take a picture of this. But
Before you do that, let me.
Get something. And let me present you. Get away with it. We have a photography here. Okay. Okay, look at the man. Look at the. There we go. You got it. Okay.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. A round of applause for a wonderful discussion, and thank you. I'm going to call now Janvi Tripathi, who's moderating the session, the hardest session of the day. So I'm going to call you to come with and introduce your panel, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Hello, sorry, we don't have a break. I'm Janvi from ORF in India. It is a pleasure to be here, thanking all the organizers for bringing us together. We have 60 minutes to solve global inequality. So not a tough task for the panel that we have. Let me invite on stage Ms. Anne Lind, former Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden and at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Professor Luciana Servo, President of IPATC in Brazil. Ms. Diana English, who is Director of Program Management at CG in Canada. Mr. Richard Ponzio from the Stimson Center in the USA. And Dr. Tenwade Ojo, who is Director for the Center of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. Look at you, all on time, all on stage. Okay. Okay, everyone can hear me. So we have 60 minutes. We will be starting, I'm going right into it. Okay. Let me start with you, Minister Lind. We've got this grand title, right? Achieving Change, a reflection on global inequality and the role of the G20. How can the EU work with the G20 members to address disparities in wealth opportunity and access to resources overall as an issue where the G20 seems to be failing for all we can see?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you for the question. Because actually we are now meeting in a time when the global inequality is not just persisting, but it's accelerating. And the asymmetric in access to capital, technology, vaccine, and climate finance have exposed deep flaws in our global economic governance. The G20, with its broad representation and influence, has the potential and therefore the responsibility to be a driver of the reforms. South Africa's G20's presidency is historic in that it places equality and the voice of the Global South in the center of the agenda. But to make the most than to be just rhetoric, we need a structural shift. Reforming multilateral financial institutions, ensuring debt justice and redistribution voice and power within the decision-making bodies are critical. So we should ask ourselves, whose priorities shape the G20's agenda? In the Global South is to be heard. It cannot remain an invited guest. It must be a co-author of the rules. If the G20 is serious about tackling inequality, then two areas demand urgent actions: the reform of our global financial institution and the integration of gender equality in the core of economic policy. First, the IMF and the World Bank. These institutions are stuck in a post-war governance mode that gives disproportionately influence to wealthy creditors' countries. As a result, the policies often reflect narrow macroeconomic priorities, emphasizing fiscal consolidation over investment in people. That model has failed. We have seen it deepen the inequalities, weaken the public service, and limit the sovereignty of developing nations. Reforming the governance, the redistribution of voting power, increasing representation of low and middle income countries, increasing the representation of women, and reforming conditionality frameworks would allow for a more balanced, democratic, and representative global financial system, one that enables countries to invest in their own development paths, not simply to stabilize debt ratios. Second, gender equality. And I'm very proud to be a former foreign minister for feminist foreign policy and also a former trade minister for feminist trade policy. And I want to be very clear. Gender equality is not a side event to growth. It is a prerequisite for growth. Yet in global economies, policy is still largely gender blind. We need gender-responsive macroeconomic policies, meaning that we must ask, how do tax policies impact women and men differently? What is trade agreements differ for men and women? And if we have a discussion or later during this conference, I will be glad to give you some concrete examples that we did for feminist trade policy. And also, who benefits from public investment and who is left out? Also here I can give you some very good example from the most gender equal town in the world. That is Umeå, that is in the very, very north of Sweden. I can tell you how they change in a feministic way snow clearing. And that actually was a fantastic, people laugh at it because it sounds stupid. What is feminist snow clearing? But I tell you, it saved so much money, but not the least, it saved so much wounds in women's bodies. Now you have something to think about. And are austerity measures dismantling the very services like healthcare, education, and childcare that women rely on and work in? A truly inclusive macroeconomic framework would prioritize investment in the care economy, conduct gender impact assessment of fiscal reforms, and ensure that recovery packages actively close gender gaps in employment and income. This is where the G20 comes in. As the premier global economic forum, it can set standards by embedding gender budgeting in its own framework, encouraging the IFIs to be mainstream in gender analysis, and ensuring G20 policies that are accountable to the women they impact. Equality is just as a theme of South Africa's presidency. It's a test of whether they are willing to shift not only just the tone of global governance, but the terms. So I look forward to this dialogue on how we can move from ambition to action, and from inclusion to influence, and from commitments to accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. Gender equality as a prerequisite for growth. That, I think, is a good note to bring you in on, Dr. Ojo. That is your area of expertise. How can global governance structures be made responsive to gender-based inequalities?
Hello, thank you. All protocols observed. As she has rightly said, gender equality or women economic empowerment is my niche. And I like talking about statistics, right? I'm coming from the African sector, right? No country or no economy has reached gender parity as at 2025, right? And according to statistics, the Global Gender Report, Iceland is leading, of course, and the only African country in the first 20 is Namibia, ranking number 8, right? And followed by Botswana, 26th, and South Africa, that we are ranking 33rd, right? Which was a subtle decline from 18th position last year. And that's a food for thought, right? And aside from these 3 countries, these 3 African countries, the rest are below 100 level in the global rank. Currently, South Africa is sitting with 42.8% in parliament representation, 44.4 provincial, 43.8 locally. And as at early 2025, we have 77% job losses for women recorded early this year, and only 44% are employed. So this brings me back to the question you're asking me, that how do we actually address gender-based equality, and what should G20 be looking into? G20 is expected to move beyond the token commitments, right? And we've been saying it, adopting a gender transformative approach, which required institutional reforms, right? That is embedded in gender equality into all policy frameworks. But aside from this, we are advocating for an intersectional approach. And by intersectional approach, we're talking about looking at the basis, the grassroots ideologies, theories, right? The theory of change, of how, right? That addresses the race, the gender, and the class when it comes to women, especially. I won't take much of your time because the minister has laid the foundation on what I want to talk about. But the key recommendations that we'll be positing today will be institutionalizing gender mainstreaming, that is ensuring that gender analyses are embedded in all G20 policy tracks, the working groups, and all the communiques. If possible, is a trial. It's something we are looking into, and which We20 is also looking into, to establish a G20 Gender Equality Council, right? that creates a permanent advisory body with feminist economists, civil society, and gender experts to guide the basic decision-making in this group. We've talked about allocating targeted financing for women, enforcing accountability mechanisms, right, that track and report on progress, because it has always been the issue of implementation. We have been conducting the research, soliciting. There have been a lot of women movements. There have been a lot of advocacies. However, when it comes to the implementation, that is where the African states are still struggling with. So how do we facilitate this theory of change, the technical know-how? How do we ensure that we solicit together and advocate and ensure that the African state is able to reach this gender parity? The issue of ensuring inclusive participation is also important. That guarantees the participation of women, especially in the global south, right? In all G20 policy deliberations, which we are doing now, and ensuring that we adopt gender-responsive data systems that mandates the collection and the use of gender-aggregated data. Many issues have been spoken on gender justice, the climate justice, energy transition. There are lots of side events we are doing in regard to that with UNFDP, with Oxfam, and so on and so forth. However, I always live with this food of thought anywhere I go. UN says it will take 136 years to reach gender parity. How long will it take Africa? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ojo. Very interesting points, which I will come back to later. Professor Servo, the Brazilian G20 presidency last year and BRICS this year have both emphasized the need for social protection and sustainable governance. What are some of the learnings which can be leveraged to deliver public goods that address present inequalities?
First, I would like to thank you very much for the T20 Organizers Committee and for Janvi for the invitation to be in this panel. I will start previous to Brazil G20 to say one thing that I think is quite important. I will bring some examples of how we are learning together and how we are putting the same agenda over and over, emphasizing this agenda. So when it comes from Indonesia, from the COVID process and all the exclusion that the COVID process has done during the Indonesia presidency, all this process of access to health, access to social protection was there. When you go to India, the discussion of just transition, the discussion of equality jobs, the 2030 agenda was there. When you come to Brazil, the T20 Brazil strengthens the 2030 agenda, it strengthens the necessity for a cooperation in a progressive fiscal tax, it strengthens the multilateral cooperation for a global alliance against hunger and poverty, for a sustainable climate and change and finance development, access to equal healthcare, the gender agenda, the discussion about discrimination. In the Leaders' Declaration of Brazil, the strength of the 2030 agenda was there, the food insecurity that was in the previous ones was there, the emphasis on the just transition, the emphasis of having a transition that considers the difference between countries and regions, the need for universal social protection, the endorsement of the ministerial declaration of a need for a much tax just system, and also the discussions about how we will go to deliver better systems for reduction of inequality, to combat gender discrimination, racism, ethnic racial discrimination, and also brings other topics like digital inclusion. So we've seen from this global South perspective that we're talking about the agendas over and over. And I think that we should continue talking about inequality and just transition and digital inclusion over and over. What is the biggest takeaway of Brazil? To say one part is to think first of a tax reform system in each country that can be more progressive and see how each country can go from there. But one of the things that Brazil brought to the agenda was the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. And this is one important takeaway for Brazilian G20. We have already 101 countries in the Global Alliance, in 30 countries from Africa. We are needing 24 more, but we have ALDA that is supporting, as has been said here, the Global Alliance. We have 29 international organizations. We have 15 foundations and 11 international institutions. Based on a national pillar, strengthen the national capacity, strengthen the possibility of achieving and accelerating the achievement of this SDG 1 and 2, a knowledge pillar that what we know exactly that works for fighting hunger and poverty, and the biggest challenge is the financial pillar. We have some promises in the financial pillar. We have the African Development Bank saying that it will put in the State of Committee 14 billion for the alliance. We have the International Development Bank saying that they are putting 25 billion for the national plans and the alliance, but you know that is not enough. So we are saying here over and over that we have to exchange knowledge, we have to do it with national contacts, but we have a huge problem of financial architecture. So when we talk about these things, we always come to the discussion of how we are going to do this, with which resources, and how we need to reform this process. We have seen here the previous tables saying about Africa, not necessarily African, but African countries with needs for that relief so that they can do their national policies. That's why we have to go further. So we have been learning, we have been saying what we need to do. And I think what we're seeing in T20 South Africa, what we see in G20 South Africa is a progress towards a global view, a South countries under development global view about what it means to be a developed process, or to be in G20 can be a pillar, a discussion, a club, but it needs to engage in these agendas that we're saying over and over, and we need to put it forward. We don't need to say, yes, we have a problem next year. We know that we have a problem, but we're doing our jobs. We are doing as T20, we're doing as leaders, some of our leaders are doing. So I would say that, I said that before, we have a Brazilian that never gets, have never get out of Braziliano Suassuna, but he's brilliant, and he say, I'm realistic with hope. So I'm realistic with hope, and I hope that everybody has hope in this change. Thank you.
Be realistic with hope. Okay, with hope. All right, Diana, what do you think are some of the structural and institutional barriers to global governance cooperation? And also, if you could tie it into the very important point that Professor Servo also made about how social reform is being impacted by these very structures, and without reform, we can't in fact have.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm keen to talk about that very point, so thank you for raising it. Two quick disclaimers. One is, while I'm here on behalf of the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, one of my favorite things about working at CIGI is that it is an intensely internally diverse intellectual culture. We disagree with each other a lot. There's rarely one CIGI view on anything. And these thoughts are certainly my own in that spirit. So the second disclaimer I should give is that while I am here listed for Canada, I'm actually a secret American. And so my thoughts will be informed both by the research that I'm proud of that CIGI does, and also as my own experience working in the US State Department and working in US Foreign Assistance as well. So thinking about this question about structural challenges to governance, a couple of people have articulated it beautifully already. Professor Lenkabula talked about all of these examples of the way in which we're seeing the world change so rapidly. Ambassador Mapongo talked about this idea of polycrisis. One of the ways I think about this is a term that's borrowed from geology and used heavily in world systems thinking called punctuated equilibrium, where you see the tectonic shifts of multiple global systems happening at the same time. And I do think we find ourselves in one of those moments. And so in that moment, I think we're actually, rather than thinking about constraint of structure, I think we're actually seeing the lack or failure of structure, the lack of formality, and that the institutions that provided much of that structure were built on norms. And those norms can be helpful when you believe in them, and when the actors in them believe in them, and when there's good intent. As a former policy staffer, I'm a big believer that good process can lead to good outcomes. And so, that process and those norms and those institutions can lend themselves to good outcomes when there is that shared sense of value. But it can also obscure. It can obscure the need for action. It can obscure the way the world is changing around those structures, and it can obscure self-interest that's masked as value or as norms. And so as we find ourselves in this sort of, tectonic moment, thinking increasingly as in a moment of geopolitical strategic behavior, and some of the research that CG produces, some of my favorite research that CG produces by a senior fellow named Folashade Soulé, who's based at the University of Ghana. She's on loan from Oxford, looking at how African governments navigate that geopolitical moment in their negotiation of digital partnerships in particular. But I don't want to spend I would look at her research, it's really quite good, but I don't want to spend my time talking about how the Global South can be resilient in this moment, because that's not really my place. And particularly recently, I've been trying to do a lot of inward looking around what the role of the Global North is, particularly coming from US foreign assistance and thinking about that in a reflective way. And I was proud of the work that I did in US foreign assistance. I believed in the work that I did in US foreign assistance. I also know it was deeply flawed, and in many ways was itself in some ways a challenge to equality and governance. But I've been trying to learn more about, and I'm particularly mourning the loss of that system, given my pride in it, even with that complexity, and particularly life-saving programs like PEPFAR that were canceled in a way that was just unconscionable. And so I've been trying to learn and think more about, as a Global North actor, how are we perpetuating challenges to the global system and to equality? And I was particularly grateful to Mr. Sachs for his comments. I learned a lot. I'm not a finance person. I'm looking forward to some of the panels tomorrow to learn more. And one of the places I've learned a great deal recently is from the Canadian Centre for African Affairs and Policy, which is a Canadian think tank founded and run by African diaspora members, advising Canada on its Africa policy and advising the Africa policy community. And they called out 3 things in a recent piece, including something that many people have mentioned already, which is how rating agencies assess risk in Africa and how that affects the cost of credit. They also talk about legal frameworks surrounding foreign direct investment and how that defines power and relationships and leverage between foreign firms, African firms, and African governments. And they also talk about the way that Western banks protect, through our banking systems and our tax systems, illicit capital flight. And so those are good lessons that I've been trying to learn. I invite my fellow Global North folks with whom this resonates to be asking this question of ourselves. And the last thing I'll leave you with is one of my favorite pieces of reading, and my education about Africa was actually from Ptolemy, around 150 in the Common Era, talking about the emergence and his enthusiasm and his observation of the emergence of Africa into what he knew as the global economy. And I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, 2,000 years later, how are we still invested in this narrative of an emergent Africa, when we know that Africa has always been engaged in the global economy? It's always participated in the global economy. The global economy has always engaged with it. But that has often been ways that are not just, that are not equitable, that are not sustainable. And so the question I find myself asking is not what structural challenges are out there, they're challenges, but what structural challenges are we introducing? What structural challenges are we maintaining? What structural challenges are we perpetuating? And if for no other reason, then those are the ones that we're probably the most likely to have power over changing. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, I know you already know your question, but your audience does not. How can the atrophy in global economic governance systems be addressed to make them more responsive to global inequalities? Please.
Thank you so much, John V, for your question. Thanks to the organizers, the T20 Secretariat team, for this chance to address this important session on inequality and the role of the G20. I think a good place to start is where the scholarship has been, especially among many of the scholars in this room. And indeed, we're finding that there's been strong rising inequality within countries in recent years, even despite the economic catch-up that we've seen between many developing countries vis-a-vis global north advanced industrialized societies. So as a result, though, the world still remains deeply unequal today. Besides the G20's concern for these issues, so prominently featured the past four G20s, one could easily argue. Later this month is, of course, the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development. At the end of the year, two critical meetings, the World Social Summit and the COP30 meeting in Belém. These issues will all feature prominently. The G20 can also play a transformative role in helping to see through implementation of concrete actions that have already been adopted at a major gathering of all 193 UN member states. I'm, of course, referring to the Summit of the Future, which took place in September of last year, the beginning of UNGA Week. And there were 6 concrete actions adopted in this document that many of you know of, the Pact for the Future, Chapter 5 on transformational global governance is where the 6 international financial architecture and financing for development reforms are located. And I believe they speak to the heart of questions about inequality and what the G20 can do. Actions 47 to 52 in particular look at the urgent need to strengthen the voice and representation of developing countries, mobilizing what Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, calls a $500 billion per annum SDG stimulus, and improving global economic and political conditions so that countries can borrow sustainably to invest in their long-term development while better responding to systemic socioeconomic shocks, as well as the catastrophic risk of climate change. In a forthcoming report of my think tank program called the Global Governance Innovation Report, we'll release it next week here in Africa at a meeting in Nairobi, the annual meeting of the Academic Council on the UN System, and we'll also have an associated meeting among African scholars. We found that there's been slow yet measurable progress across much of the agenda, the 56 actions within the Pact for the Future. The critical actions, though, talking about on IFA, International Financial Architecture Reform, identified from our own research 3 major global economic governance gaps that the influential G20 countries and the 2 regional groupings of the AU and the EU but must tackle head on. This is about, of course, reducing widespread inequality and promoting broad-based development. They are, of course, and we hear these numbers in many of the task force sessions, the annual US $4 trillion financing deficit encountered by developing countries for realizing the SDGs. Secondly, the governments committed in Baku this last November to a $300 billion commitment by 2035, still down the road. But many experts in the climate space know that the target for climate finance needs to be much closer to 1.3 trillion. So that will come up again, of course, later this year in Belém. Third and finally, and we heard about this in the last session, developing countries typically pay about twice as much in interest on sovereign debt as developed nations. The cost of capital issue, I think, really at the heart of the G20 South Africa presidency. So in response to these major gaps, among the closely interrelated IFA reforms advanced in the Pact for the Future, I'm going to cover one now, and I think there's a second round of questions where I'll put forward 2 additional global governance innovations. But it's the issue of inequality in decision-making, especially in the IFIs. The World Bank, in particular, despite having 80% of the world's population, the developing country constitutes less than 40% of the World Bank's voting power. Fortunately, we're actually seeing some progress in the sister institution of the World Bank, the IMF, adding a 25th executive board seat at the end of last year for sub-Saharan Africa. But secondly, and happening this month in Washington, is the ongoing 17th General Review of the IMF quotas, which will adjust quota shares to better reflect members' positions in the global economy while safeguarding, and this is critically important, the shares of the poorest members of the IMF fund. So let me stop there, but I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass this mic down the panel. And I'm going to ask you my one question, which is, and this is a question posed to us by our organizers. What practical recommendations can be put forward to ensure that the G20's commitments translate into meaningful action?
No, I just went there. Tired of hearing me.
Let's start at that end and work on back. So I'm the one being put on the spot. Thank you. So yeah, I'm back to what I always advocate for, inclusive participation when it comes to gender inclusion, right? Ensuring that there is actually enough representation when it comes to gender parity. That we're still lacking in African states. Only 3 countries are holding us up and giving us the statistics of 40.2% on the gender index. However, we really need to buckle up and ensure that women representation. I was talking with a colleague earlier on that this subtle decline is being left unnoticed, right? So there's a subtle decline in women leadership. And how do we ensure that this leadership position are sustained? They are not just occupied, but they are sustained. Thank you.
I will endorse her statement. I'll say that we have to move forward with the Global Alliance. That's something quite important. That's something that we can concrete do, and that's something that can accelerate the SDG 1 and 2. So this is part of the declarations, it's part of the discussion here. The SDG is part of discussion. I think there is a concrete example of something that can be done from the knowledge pillar, national plans, and then we will add the discussion of financing with all other discussions that we have here. I also say, besides gender, we really need to think for some countries, the ethnical and racial and other forms of discrimination. This is something for a country like Brazil that we cannot go through anymore. We have proposed in the UN the SDG 18 of ethnical and racial inequality, and that's something that we cannot develop if we don't deal with this. So for Brazilian perspective, this is something quite important for us, and I don't think that's only for Brazilian perspective. In Latin America, we've been talking about it. We have some alliances to go through it with ECLAC and other institutions. So I hope that it's gained the international agenda also.
Well, thank you. I will have 5 short things on the general things I think G20 can do, and then 4 on gender. But first, when it comes to multilateral reforms, I think that the reforming of IMF and the World Bank voting structure must be in the central and the most priority of the G20 agenda. And then when it comes to second, that's the debt justice, because now we have heard in the latest panel and also a little bit here about how unequal it is when paying. So the G20 really must push for comprehensive debt relief mechanism and not just temporary suspension, but a permanent one. And then there was a question, and this will be coming back tomorrow, about climate finance. And I think that if G20 is serious about inequality, it must also deliver on climate financing pledges. And that's not just the quantity, but also accessibility and the fairness. And then it comes to one of our famous R that we always have in the feminist foreign policy, representation, rights, and now I forget the third. And that's a representation, and that we should challenge the idea that the Global South must continuously prove its credibility to participants. it should be conditional that there is equal representation. It's a right and not something that you should be thankful for. And this goes also, of course, for women. And then finally, too often there is a lot of declaration from G20 that sounds progressive, sounds good, but there is a lack of enforcement. So if we can create an independent accountability mechanism to try G20 commitments on inequality, that would be good. That will be long term, I understand, but at least to start the work. And then for short on gender, because I think that there should be gender impact assessment of all fiscal and monetary policy. For example, austerity cuts is often disproportionately bad for women. For example, women are more employed in services. And then the financing of the care economy. There should be investment in universal childcare and elderly care. These are one of the reforms that is making the Nordic countries on top of the gender index that you talked about. One of the most important thing is to have disaggregated data. And I can tell you shortly, then when we had a feminist trade policy, we didn't know what is a feminist trade policy, and we couldn't do anything until we found this aggregated data. And then we found in the trade agreements, this was from United States to others, a silk blouse had 6 times as high tariff as an equivalent man's shirt, 6 times as high. When it comes to sports gear, it was 3 times as high tariff as for men's sportswear. And for underwear, it was double. And there was no other explanation than the gender. So yeah, this is for real. So disaggregated data. And then finally, I think that the G20 should have much more program for women entrepreneurs, because women-owned businesses face major financing gaps. And still we know that the women, for example, now you see Ukraine, the most new businesses, the most entrepreneurial new ways are by women. So Ukrainian women have become a backbone of the Ukrainian economy in these war-ridden times. So, well, that's some of the things I think G20 needs to do.
I'm just going to say cancel the interest. Not to make light of it, but I was a US university student. I had student loans. I understand what compounding interest does to debt. And as you know, there's a large debate in the United States about student loan, much of which was cancel the debt, which wouldn't have actually solved the problem for the next entering freshman class. The biggest problem in US student loans is the way in which interest is handled, which is unique to student loans as opposed to other forms of debt in the United States. So it's part of the reason why there's a particular crisis there. So there just has to be a way of working down what that level of service is, whether it's canceling the entire interest or a portion of it, bringing it into alignment with other interest levels for international debt. But I think that has to be just clearly called for.
Right. 2 more concrete reform proposals. The debt issue that has come up repeatedly, it inhibits, of course, delivery of the SDGs and the wider development agenda. The Pact for the Future underscores a number of reform proposals, but it's all around the issue of more effective, predictable, and transparent mechanisms for debt restructuring and relief. And I really echo Anne's point about the need for a permanent mechanism to address these issues, because we keep jumping around, especially through the G20, on stopgap bandages instead of something permanent. One idea that we caught in our research, though, that speaks to the task force on climate action is climate resilient debt clauses. And there's, of course, climate for debt swaps, but The climate resilient debt clauses allow for deferral of debt repayments in the events of natural disasters. This has been picked up by 5 of the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank and the ADB, the African Development Bank, all committing to its adoption. The main proposal, though, I'd like to share that I think ties together many of these proposals could address issues at the heart of the review that is going on, led by South Africa, of the G20 itself and its relationship with the wider system. It's found in Action 48 of the Pact for the Future. It's a call for a biennial summit on the global economy. And I'll quote the exact language: at the level of heads of state and government, to strengthen and establish more systemic links and coordination between the United Nations and the international financial institutions. So, of course, being the UN engages the General Assembly, the 193 member states, but it's going to, I think, get a real jolt of support if the G20 was to prioritize its own engagement, to be showing up, as many G20 heads of state do not anymore, show up in September in New York every year. This would be every 2 years. And the idea now is for the G20 South Africa, for the work of researchers like our network, the T20, to really get behind what this proposal is all about. In the language of the Pact for the Future, it's about inclusive participation. It's about developing countries being able to respond better to systemic shocks. Let's remember that the 2008-9 financial crisis is what led to the upgrade of the G20 to a heads of state level. And it proved itself, of course, repeatedly, both in the Paris Climate Agreement, getting it across the finish line in 2015, and of course, the pandemic recovery efforts of recent years. So besides those types of issues, today, at the heart of it is overcoming growing divisions between these 2 major groupings of states, the G7, which just met in Canada, and the BRICS Plus, which will soon meet in Brazil. We really need a more coherent and effective way for managing critical, if we have a Security Council on global peace and security, we need a similar body on economic, social, environmental issues, but that's synced up with the wider UN system membership. So we put forward a number of ideas during the T20 Brazil, and really hope that it's the T20 South Africa, now that this idea has been adopted in the Pact for the Future, that can get us across the finish line and upgrade the name even and call it something more like a biennial UN G20 plus summit on the global economy. And, you know, it's not enough to just have another gathering that happens every 2 years without proper planning, follow-up, monitoring, and attention for coherence between the different policy fields that are taken up within the G20. So this is why we're advocating the need for a small, light, cost-efficient, and even virtual networked secretariat. It would be led by the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Amina Mohammed, but includes senior staff from the international financial institutions, the WTO, the International Labor Organization, and of course, the WTO in Geneva, but the rotating G20 presidency would be a key part. And at the heart of it is a term that comes up repeatedly in our task forces, the need for greater accountability, but also to not underemphasize the knowledge transfer role that we play, but that this secretariat would play. And we would feed into this secretariat to collect, validate, and push out collective analysis across the international system between summits. One final point is that many of our colleagues over the years have attempted to bring in scorecards and ways of measuring performance. It's something I think that the T20 should be doing even collectively going forward. But it's also a role of these member states. I know that the G20 should be kept informal and not repeat the major multilateral institutions, but it's through this particular idea that has been adopted in a major world summit last year to bring the UN system as a whole and the multilateral institutions, which are the key bodies for implementing the ideas coming out of G20 summits. It's time that we make something coherent, but it's time that we hold these governments' feet to the fire, hold them to account, and not allow them to shirk their responsibilities. So having a fully staffed biennial summit every 2 years, backed up by scholars like our own network, I think is a combination and an opportunity not to be missed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have 10 minutes left for audience questions. So if there are mics, the organizers. Yes, there's a question here. And we'll collect about 2-3 questions, and if you could state your name and organization and whom your question is addressed to.
Thank you. My name is Alex Rusero from Zimbabwe, based at Africa University. I was expecting the panel to speak something pertaining the current world order punctuated by global chaos and global criminality, and how that impacts issues of inequality. So you look at the current dynamics of Iran, Israel, it's about egos of men, inflated men egos, but the ultimate victim is always the woman. If you look statistically, how many women have been affected by this criminality and war all over. Israel and Iran are just anecdotal. So wouldn't it be prudent to have some sort of a genderized peace agenda for the G20? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Further questions, audience? Okay, so while you think of your questions, Minister, if you could answer that. And then
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's right to the point. I would say two things. One thing first about how this chaos is actually deepening the inequality. And the main thing is that now the development cooperation financing is cut short. And you can see it very clearly, not only in, United States, where they totally abolished USAID, and from, I think, yesterday or in this week, maybe all staff was laid off. Everybody in all embassies all over the world. They were not allowed to work anymore. You can see in UK, where they are going to raise the defense spending, but unfortunately they are going to pay for it with the development aid. And the Labour, and I come from the same political family, but here I'm disappointed because they said that they should reason from they had 0.5 to 0.7, and now instead they are going down to 0.3, and because they are paying also for refugees and so on that you can, it's ODI compatible, they will actually go down to 0.1 in real terms. The Swedish government has decided to cut development aid. We had 1%, now it's going to be below 0.7, which is what UN said. The Dutch government is going to take about 1/3 of their development aid down. And all of this will, of course, be very hard on those countries that really need it, which is in the global south, most of it. And also many European countries, like my own country, and I repeat, I'm not in the government. I'm not in the government now. I left 2 years ago. The right-wing government has decided that we should only do things that are of national Swedish interest, and we should only do things that is in the vicinity. So they've taken away all the global south activities we had. For example, cut everything that has to do with Yemen and Burma and everything. And that is, of course, a result of all of this has happened. Then when it comes to women, yes, I hope that the G7 would find something like has been done when it comes to security policy, which is the famous Article 1325 in the UN statute with women, peace and security that has really, really made an impact. And I'm very, very happy that the new NATO Secretary General from the Netherlands, one of the first things he did was to extend the mandate for the Special Rapporteur on Women, Peace and Security, Irene Fellini, for those of you who are interested in those issues. And he decided that number 2 in NATO, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, is Radmila Sekerinska, a former defense minister from North Macedonia, also member of the FEPS, Feminist Foreign Policy Progressive Voices Collective, where I co-chair together with the coordinator of Socialist International from the Philippines, Mrs. Macris Cabreros. And he chose her to be the number 2 in NATO, a well-known, dedicated feminist. And I think that says something about where they want to go. So I think that if you can find something like women economy and whatever, I mean, you're great at you're great at this. So maybe that is a possibility.
Thank you very much. So I did mention that the inclusion of the G20 Women Working Group, right? We couldn't be breaking all these factors because there are a lot of factors that are influencing women, right? Especially African women. So standing within the cap of what I was asked to present, that was why I just put that what we really need is the inclusion, right, of that G20 working group that will advocate the gender, that will advocate the women, the youth, and the children, right, who are actually being victims and are part of the marginalized groups, and they are vulnerable. There is nobody to advocate for them. In Africa, we could count the countries that are, facing the conflict right now, and you'll see that those countries on the gender index, they are on 141, 142. Some hardly have one woman parliamentarian, right, in the seat of government. Nobody to represent them, nobody to advocate for them, right? And this is the grassroots. This is what we really need to address. For us to be able to go into all these things, looking into, we were talking with Herin, the director for Qatar, South Africa Center for Peace, right? On how do we ensure we advocate finance for women who are affected by these conflicts? So these and many more, there are a lot of issues that we have explored, in terms of this gender parity. So yes, I agree with you, Dr. Lucero, that we need that gendered panel, right, that advocate for peace and security. But most importantly, please, let us ensure we advocate for this working group so that women's voices are actually, represented in the seat of power, in the seat of decision. Thank you.
You have a mic already, ma'am? Yes.
Thank you. Erin McCandless from University of Johannesburg, director of the Qatar South Africa Center for Peace. And I just love all the women-led panels and women presenters. It's phenomenal. So I have two questions. One, building on much of what you've said so far, but and it goes into this issue of conflict and polycrisis and the issue of horizontal inequalities. I mean, most people talk about vertical inequalities, but horizontal inequalities, as we know, are group inequalities along racial, ethnic, class lines. And this is obviously really important in this era of polycrisis, where intersecting crises affect the vulnerable the most. And so I just wondered, what are your one or two key most critical policy interventions right now, do you think, that could address horizontal inequalities? And secondly, what specific leverage or added value do you think the G20 has over other political blocs to really address the issue of inequality, particularly now as South Africa is highlighting it so much in its presidency? Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting questions, but I have spied Professor Naidu on the side, which means we're nearly out of time. So you each have 1 minute to react to that with your permission, and then we will close.
Sure, and great questions, Professor McCandless. And on political blocks, the one thing I wanted to say, there's a lot of fear started by the Secretary General of a new Cold War emerging. And of course, the two big blocks that everybody talks about, the BRICS Plus and the G7, come together through the G20. And it's critical that they take every step to prevent a new Cold War. And speaking to the last set of questions about global chaos and calamity, they need to use the charter-based institutions that we have, the Security Council, which are deemed unrepresentative and paralyzed through the veto power of the Permanent Five. The G20 can do something about that. But on the specific point of the poly crisis, yeah, it's absolutely these integrative concepts of peace building and human security, which I believe, working with the multilateral institutions that deliver programs on the ground, that the G20 can influence those agendas, because they're not strictly pure conflict resolution of a traditional sense. They absolutely deal with inequality issues, environmental and social dimensions that are at the heart of the G20 agenda.
Thank you. First of all, Professor McCandless, it's lovely to see you. Second of all, I want to talk to you more so I understand what you mean by horizontal inequalities after this. But to your second question around the G20 and the specific value added, I think it was interesting looking at the G7 last week hosted in Canada and how many countries were represented. It was much more than 7. And so I think one of the things that, particularly as we see single states, the United States, others, carrying so much unilateral weight at this point and separating themselves so much from the pack, the weight of consensus, right? The weight of community. If you want to go slow to go together, and I'm sympathetic because I also like to go fast, but the weight that can bring as a broader community, I think is really valuable. And even in places where it's not, like it's being invited in. And so I think the weight of the diversity within the G20 and the broader community can speak with a lot of strength that other coalitions that are maybe more built on interest or narrowly defined have trouble doing.
I will say that the extra value for G20 is to keep G20 and the T20. And I think that knowing after both Brazil and now South Africa, who has put some of the main issues that need to be fixed on the absolute, putting the spotlight on it, the next presidency, United States. And we know that United States has already left several of the very important multilateral organizations. I was minister during the first Trump administration, and it was not easy because we couldn't even, for the first time ever, we didn't get a final document for the Arctic Council, because if you mention any of those dirty words like women, like gender, like environment, like inclusion, they won't sign it. And it's worse now. So, and we also have heard from different sources that they are not interested in keeping T20. And I think that here we need from the civil society and the think tanks to make clear how important it is to keep T20 and to keep it together with G20. I mean, not as an ad hoc, but as Brazil and South Africa so excellently has done. So I think here is a real challenge. And if it goes down, for 1 year, then it's very difficult to take it up again. So this is where my worries are. More than anything else when it comes to how G20 will be able to influence the coming years.
I totally agree. The question is how to maintain it in the agenda and how to strengthen ourselves as a group in a club that might be some downfalls. For sure, it's having been some downfalls. We have seen this when strong governments said that we cannot use gender or any other humanitarian term in our declarations. So you have to work to maintain the T20 in the agenda, to maintain the gender agenda in the agenda, to maintain the inequality topics in the agenda. And if the government, one government of G20 say we're not going to put, I think you have to see how we go through our governments to maintain it in the agenda. because we cannot let the G20 and the T20 succumb because of one government. It is, for me, it's completely irrational. So if you cannot do the meeting in the USA, let's do the meeting elsewhere. Yeah. And besides that, I think we have a lot of capacity building in this process, and we have learned a lot in the capacity building. And we have other forums also. We are going to the Finance for Development with women in trade, women in finance, women in many agendas. And this is a capital that brings from G20 to other forum to this. The BRICS that has not that strong gender agenda, but has a discussion about anti-discrimination and other things that can be brought. So let's keep in the agenda. Let's be think tanks.
Thank you very much. I was having an earlier discussion with Prof. Ntembo and Prof. Zondi, and we were exploring this theory of change, right? How do we endorse this? So how do we ensure that we're able to influence positively and ensure that whatever we are presenting to the states, to the G20 is actually endorsed? So we need to redress, right, the way our leaders are approaching this. We know most leaders are educated, they know what to do, they've heard of these, they're hearing these policies again and again. But how do we ensure that they actually foster this change that we want to see? And that is the technical know-how which we need to redress. And personally, I am calling for a capacity building. I'm not saying they are not educated, but facilitating an inter-regional shared approaches and lessons which they can learn from each other and see how each regions are actually working towards these solutions. I was talking to a colleague in Jamaica, and they were talking about, for the first time, women representation in Jamaica is 55%. However, right? However, nothing has been done. In fact, the situation on ground is even worse than when women representation was on the high rise. So what do we do to facilitate this change that we want to see? And that is what we should be presenting to the G20. Thank you.
That note, we will close this session. Thank you so much to my panelists for the very insightful comments that we got. I'm sad I can't summarize it for all of you. I'm sure you can watch it on the T20 YouTube channels at some point. Over to you.
You've got to capture it. And this will be from us. So you can take a panel picture. So while they're doing that, I want to thank Janvi and the panel. I think this was a really, really insightful, illustrious, made us think, and the gender issue that came up over and over again. And I think for tomorrow, it will be something that we have to also include in these discussions. Having said that, I'm bringing the day to a close. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here, for staying with us. To participants online, you all deserve a round of applause. Thank you. Just a few housekeeping rules. For those of you who are staying at the hotel,